Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. Are you ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely ready to go.
Today we're tackling a case that's been in the headlines for decades. It's one that's, I think, captured the imagination of, well, pretty much everyone who's heard about it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's got all the elements of a true crime, thriller, mystery, family drama, and even beauty pageants.
You're talking about the JonBenét Ramsey case?
Right. That's the one. The murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey on December 26, 1996 in Boulder, Colorado.
It's a case that's just full of twists and turns and, frankly, dead ends. It's been almost 30 years, and we still don't have a definitive answer.
Nope. And that's what makes it so fascinating and frustrating at the same time.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the case, let's start with the basics. What happened on that day after Christmas in 1996?
So JonBenét was found dead in the basement of her family home.
And how was she found?
Her body was discovered. She had suffered a skull fracture and was strangled with a garrote. It was actually made from a paintbrush handle and nylon cord.
Okay, so already we have a pretty gruesome scene, right?
Oh, absolutely. This was not a random act of violence. This was personal.
And to make things even more complicated, there's a ransom note involved.
Yeah, that's right. A very strange ransom note, too. I mean, it wasn't your typical scribbled message. It was 2.5 pages long.
2.5 pages. That seems excessive for a ransom note.
It was very unusual. And the contents of the note were odd, too. The language was almost theatrical. Very dramatic. And get this, the amount of money demanded was $118,000.
Okay, that number sounds familiar. Doesn't that have some connection to JonBenét's father, John Ramsey?
You got it. It was almost the exact amount of his bonus from the previous year.
So right away, investigators are probably thinking this ransom note feels staged. It's like someone's trying too hard.
Exactly. It raised a lot of red flags right from the start, and that's before they even began to process the rest of the crime scene.
Which I'm assuming had its own set of peculiarities.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of things that just didn't add up.
Like what? What were some of the things that stood out to investigators?
Well, for one, there were no signs of forced entry. The house seemed almost too undisturbed for a crime of this nature.
So if it wasn't a random break-in, then how did the killer get in?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that investigators have been grappling with for decades.
Okay, so we have a seemingly staged crime scene, a bizarre ransom note, and no obvious signs of how the killer got into the house. What happened next?
Well, JonBenét's mother, Patsy, called 911 at 5:52 a.m. to report her daughter missing.
And she mentioned the ransom note.
Yes, she told the operator about the note and said they were supposed to wait for further instructions.
Okay, but I'm guessing the police didn't just sit around waiting for a call from the kidnappers.
Right. Oh, no, of
Yeah.
course not. They responded immediately. But by the time they arrived, things had already gotten a bit messy.
Messy, how so?
Well, there were already friends and family members at the house, and the crime scene hadn't been properly secured.
So people were walking around potentially contaminating evidence.
That's right. It wasn't the ideal situation for a crime scene investigation. And to make matters worse,
Oh no, there's more.
yeah, John Ramsey himself was the one who found JonBenét's body in the basement.
He found the body before the police could properly secure the area.
Yes, and he actually carried her body upstairs before forensics could examine the scene.
Wow. That's a pretty major misstep in any investigation. Allowing the father of the victim to potentially contaminate the crime scene.
It was definitely a controversial move, and it's something that has been scrutinized and criticized ever since.
So from the very beginning, it seems like there were some oversights and missteps that really complicated this investigation.
Absolutely. Those early hours were crucial, and the way the scene was handled or mishandled really had a lasting impact on the case.
Before we go any further, let me just take a quick moment to remind our listeners that if you're enjoying this deep dive, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future episodes of Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We have so many more captivating cases to explore.
Now back to the investigation.
Right, so we've set the scene, we've talked about the crime scene, the ransom note, and some of the initial missteps by the police. What other key pieces of evidence emerged as investigators began to dig deeper?
Well, the autopsy revealed some crucial details that added another layer of mystery to the case.
Like what? What did the autopsy show?
Well, one of the most puzzling findings was the presence of pineapple in JonBenét's stomach.
Pineapple. Okay, that seems random. Why was that significant?
A bowl of pineapple was found in the kitchen, but neither parent could recall giving her any that night.
So we have this mystery bowl of pineapple. It's like a small detail, but it just adds to the overall strangeness of the case.
It does. And it raised questions about whether the crime scene had been deliberately staged.
You mean like someone planted the pineapple to make it look like JonBenét had eaten it shortly before her death?
Exactly. It's possible that whoever was responsible was trying to create a false trail, a distraction from the real events.
Okay, so now we have this element of potential staging. But why? What was the motive behind that?
That's the question that has haunted investigators for years. And it leads us to the two main theories that have dominated the JonBenét Ramsey case from the beginning.
The family member theory and the intruder theory.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the two big ones. And they've both been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate.
All right, so let's break those down a little bit. Starting with the family member theory. What were the key pieces of evidence or arguments that led investigators to focus on the Ramseys?
Well, as we've mentioned, the seemingly staged crime scene was a major red flag. The lack of forced entry, the elaborate ransom note, the location of the body, all of these pointed towards the possibility of an inside job.
And statistically speaking, in cases involving the murder of a child, family members are often involved.
That's right. So it's natural for investigators to look at the family first.
And Patsy Ramsey in particular faced a lot of scrutiny, didn't she?
Yes, she did. There were theories about her potentially snapping, having a violent outburst, maybe triggered by JonBenét's bedwetting.
But were any of those theories ever substantiated?
Not really. There was never any concrete evidence to support those claims.
And what about Burke? JonBenét's brother? He was only 9 at the time? Was he ever considered a suspect?
Burke was interviewed by investigators, but he was never officially considered a suspect by the police.
But there's been a lot of speculation about his possible involvement over the years.
Right.
Yes.
There have been documentaries and books that have explored the possibility of Burke accidentally harming his sister and then the parents covering it up.
But Burke and his family have always maintained his innocence.
That's correct. And it's important to remember that speculation is not the same as evidence.
Right. And then there's the grand jury that convened in 1999. They actually voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death.
Yes. But the district attorney at the time refused to sign the indictment.
Saying there wasn't enough evidence.
Exactly. So even with all the information they had access to, the grand jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. And the DA wasn't convinced that there was enough to move forward with the trial.
So on the one hand, we have this cloud of suspicion hanging over the Ramsey family, fueled by the circumstances of the crime and the lack of any other obvious suspects. But then we have this other theory, the intruder theory.
Right. And that theory is largely based on the presence of unknown male DNA found at the crime scene.
So there's evidence that someone else was there, someone outside the family.
Yes. And that's what makes this case so perplexing. We have these two seemingly plausible but conflicting theories.
It's like a giant puzzle where some of the pieces just don't seem to fit.
That DNA evidence became a real turning point in the case. In 2008, the district attorney, Mary Lacey, actually cleared the entire Ramsey family as suspects based solely on that DNA.
So she was basically saying that this unknown male must have been the killer.
That was her conclusion. It was a bold move, and a lot of people disagreed with her.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have been a tough call to make, especially with so much public pressure and scrutiny.
Oh, absolutely. This case was constantly in the headlines, and everyone had an opinion.
But the DNA didn't match any of the Ramseys or anyone they knew.
Right. That's right. And Lacey argued that the evidence pointed away from the family and toward an unknown intruder.
Okay, so that seemed to settle things for a while. But then I remember reading something about further analysis of the DNA.
You're right. The story doesn't end there. A few years later, more advanced DNA testing was done, and it revealed something really interesting.
What's that?
It suggested that there might have been multiple unknown DNA profiles present on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails.
Hold on. Multiple unknown individuals. So we're not just talking about one mysterious intruder anymore.
It's possible. And this new information really threw a wrench into everything. It meant that the crime scene might have been even more complicated than anyone initially thought.
Wow, so now the intruder theory is back on the table, maybe even stronger than before.
Exactly. If there were multiple intruders, well, that opens up a whole new set of possibilities.
And raises even more questions. Who are these people? How did they get in? And why were they there?
Those are the questions that investigators are still trying to answer.
It seems like every time we get a little closer to the truth, something new pops up and complicates things even further.
That's the nature of this case. It's a real puzzle.
So let's go back to those two main theories. We've talked about the family member theory and the evidence that seemed to support it. But what about the intruder theory? And what were some of the specific details that led some investigators to believe that someone broke into the house and committed the crime?
Well, one key piece of evidence was a broken basement window. It appeared to have been forced open.
So that would be a pretty clear sign of an intruder.
Right. It would seem that way. But there were some questions about whether that window had been broken before that night.
Really?
Yeah, there were reports that the Ramseys had mentioned the broken window to friends in the days leading up to the murder.
So it might not have been related to the crime at all.
It's possible,
Mm-hmm.
but it's definitely something that investigators had to consider.
And wasn't there also a rash of burglaries happening in Boulder around that time?
Yes, that's right. The neighborhood had been experiencing a series of break-ins, so it wouldn't have been unusual for an intruder to target the Ramsey home.
It all starts to make sense now. A broken window, a history of burglaries. It seems like a pretty strong case for the intruder theory.
But there were still some things that didn't add up. For example, the elaborate ransom note and the seemingly staged nature of the crime scene.
Right. Those details seem more consistent with a planned cover-up than a random act of violence by an intruder.
Exactly. And that's what made this case so difficult to solve. There were pieces of evidence that seemed to support both theories.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle where some of the pieces belong to a completely different puzzle.
A very frustrating puzzle indeed.
And then we have the whole Lou Smith saga. Can you tell us a bit about him?
Oh, Lou Smith. He was a fascinating character in this case. A very experienced detective with a solid reputation.
And he was convinced that an intruder was responsible.
Absolutely. He was so sure of it that he actually resigned from the case in protest.
I mean, he quit. Why?
He felt that the investigation had become too focused on the Ramseys, and he believed that they were innocent.
So he was willing to walk away from the case because he felt so strongly about it.
Yes, he was a man of principle, and he believed that the truth was being ignored.
It takes a lot of courage to do something like that, to go against the grain and stand up for what you believe in.
It does, and Lou Smith definitely had that courage. He dedicated a lot of time and energy to trying to prove the intruder theory, even after he left the official investigation.
So he really believed in his heart that the Ramseys were innocent.
Oh, without a doubt. He was their biggest advocate. And he spent years trying to find evidence that would clear their names.
And he wasn't afraid to challenge the official narrative or the way the investigation was being handled.
Nope, he wasn't. He spoke out against what he saw as tunnel vision on the part of the police and the media.
And he pointed to specific evidence that he believed supported the intruder theory.
Right. He argued that the broken basement window was a clear sign of a break-in. And he believed that the crime scene had been staged to make it look like the Ramseys were involved.
So we have these two very different perspectives on the case. The family member theory, which focused on the Ramseys, and the intruder theory, which was championed by Lou Smith.
And both sides had their own set of evidence and arguments to support their claims.
It's really remarkable how this case continues to divide people even after all these years.
It is. It's a testament to the complexity of the evidence and the human desire to make sense of tragedy.
We want answers. We want to know who did it and why.
But sometimes those answers are elusive, especially in a case like this. It really is a case that just keeps you thinking.
It does. So we got these two main theories and a whole lot of unanswered questions. But you mentioned earlier that there's been a renewed push to use advanced technology to re-examine the evidence.
Right, exactly. I mean, DNA technology has come a long way since 1996.
So what's being done now that wasn't possible back then?
Well, the Boulder Police Department has partnered with a private lab to reanalyze all the DNA evidence using the latest techniques.
And what are they hoping to find?
Well, the biggest hope is that they might be able to extract more information from the existing samples, maybe identify new DNA profiles or even get a clearer picture of the ones they already have.
So it's possible that we could finally get a match to that unknown male DNA.
It's definitely possible. With these new technologies and expanded databases, it's not out of the question.
And if they do get a match, that would be huge, right? I mean, that could potentially crack the case wide open.
It could. I mean, imagine if they find a match to someone who had a history of violence or who was in Boulder at the time of the murder.
That would be a game changer.
It would.
Yeah.
Of course, there's also the chance that the new analysis won't reveal anything new or that it will just raise more questions.
Right. It's always a possibility with a case this complex.
But even if we don't get a definitive answer, I think it's important that they're still actively pursuing this case.
It shows that they haven't given up on finding justice for JonBenét.
Exactly. And it gives us all a little bit of hope that maybe someday we'll finally know the truth.
This case has captivated so many people for so long. Why do you think that is? What makes the JonBenét Ramsey case so enduringly fascinating?
I think it's a combination of factors. You've got the tragedy of a young child's death under such mysterious circumstances.
It's a story that really touches a nerve.
It does. And then you have the media attention, which was relentless from the very beginning.
I mean, this case was everywhere. On TV and the newspapers, it was impossible to escape.
Right. And that constant coverage definitely played a role in keeping the case in the public consciousness.
And let's not forget all the twists and turns, the conflicting evidence, the strange details. It's like a real-life whodunit.
It is. And people love a good mystery.
You want to solve the puzzle. We want to know who did it and why.
Exactly. I think there's a part of us that wants to believe that even in the face of such a horrible tragedy, there's an explanation, a reason.
We want to make sense of the senseless.
And maybe that's why this case continues to fascinate us. Because it's a reminder that sometimes there are no easy answers.
That some mysteries may never be fully solved.
It's a sobering thought. But it's also a reminder that the pursuit of justice is always worthwhile.
Even if it takes decades.
Even if it takes a lifetime.
Well said. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the JonBenét Ramsey case. It's a case that continues to haunt and intrigue us all. And who knows, maybe someday with the help of new technology, we'll finally get the answers we've been searching for.
I hope so. But even if we don't, it's a story that will continue to be told and debated for years to come.
Because it's a story that reminds us of the fragility of life, the importance of justice, and the enduring power of mystery.
And that's something we should never forget.
Thanks for listening to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast.